Mr. President.
Democratic leader, thank you.
Soon to be.
Yes.
Mr. President, everywhere you look, Republicans are one big hot mess. The reason is simple. Donald Trump is pursuing policies that are terrible for America and despised by the American people. The Republicans know just how unpopular Trump's agenda is, but they fall into line out of fear or blind loyalty, or some of each. Republicans better smarten up and press Trump to back off his radical proposals during their lunch tomorrow, or they'll pay a price for ignoring the American people. Now on Iran. With his failed and reckless war in Iran, Trump has turned the art of the deal into the art of the blunder. Donald Trump, Marco Rubio, and J.D. Vance are too afraid to come in front of the American people and the whole Senate to defend their war and so-called understanding. So now Trump will talk only to Senate Republicans behind closed doors. Senate Republicans need to grill Donald Trump for answers on where negotiations stand when he meets with them at the Capitol tomorrow. Trump and Vance haven't even finished their phony victory lap yesterday when Iran announced that it did not make any commitments to allow nuclear inspections. No commitments to allow nuclear inspections, even though that was supposed to be one of the mainstays of what Trump was pursuing. Trump also claimed that the Strait of Hormuz is fully open, even though shipping through the waterway remains a small fraction of what it was before the war. And more than a week after announcing side deals and so-called understandings with Iran, the administration still hasn't briefed Congress or the American people on what's actually been agreed to. Wishful thinking won't end this war, and certainly Senate Republicans' calls to pump hundreds of billions of dollars more into Trump's fiasco will make matters even worse. Republicans can complain about Trump's war, his secrecy, and his disastrous deal with Iran all they want behind closed doors. But the only way to ensure this war ends once and for all is for Republicans to act. Later today, Democrats will once again put Republicans on the record on whether they want Trump's disastrous war to continue by forcing a vote on the House-passed Iran War Powers Resolution for the first time. We've held 9 other votes on our War Powers Resolution to end the war, and Senate Republicans have left the American people disappointed each time. We have forced this fight on the floor again and again for more than 100 days, and only Congress has the power to take our nation to war, not Donald Trump alone. Republicans need to support our War Powers Resolution to end the war, and they need to hold Trump's feet to the fire in their meeting tomorrow. On the SAVE database, yesterday's court decision bodes very poorly for the SAVE Act's survival. Free and fair elections in America got a big boost in court yesterday when a federal judge, blocked Donald Trump's effort to set up a massive voter purge database. The absolute last person Americans want combing through their personal data is Donald Trump. Letting Trump scrape through Americans' private data to purge them from voter rolls isn't just unpopular, it's illegal. Donald Trump, Elon Musk, Russell Vought wanted to plug in America's sensitive personal information, including Social Security information, into their shoddy database and have DOJ's algorithm decide who gets to vote. It's sci-fi voter suppression, authoritarianism by algorithm. Trump cares so little about Americans' freedom that he's trampling on their right to privacy just so he can take away their right to vote. For months, I've been saying this database was one of Trump's most sinister strategies for subverting our elections in November. That's why Senate Democrats have blocked the SAVE Act, Trump's extreme anti-election legislation, over and over and over again. Democrats will keep fighting Trump's plan to rig the rules in November because in our country, Americans decide elections, not algorithms installed by Musk, Doge, and Trump. And finally, on Tulsi Gabbard and the Pulte purge. There are reports that Tulsi Gabbard was receiving instructions from a so-called guru and repeating them word for word. That ought to concern all of us if it's true. No one knows who this guru really is, what his connections are, and where the instructions came from. Maybe it was completely innocent, or maybe not, but we need answers. In appointing Bill Pulte to serve as acting DNI after Tulsi Gabbard, Donald Trump's replacing a guru with a grifter. Bill Pulte doesn't have an ounce of national security experience or an ounce of integrity, and he's already started to purge the intelligence experts who have that integrity. God only knows what Pulte plans to do next. Will Pulte interfere in our elections, expose intelligence sources, abuse Americans' private data, go after Trump's political enemies like he's done so many times before? With his insistence on installing Pulte, Trump has embarrassed his own party, weakened our national security, and endangered the American people, all to serve his personal political interests. When it comes to protecting Americans' national security, we need an adult in the room, and Pulte's removing them left and right. And finally, on our Spotlight Forum on the Dobbs decision. Later today, I will join Senator Murray and other Senate Democrats for a Spotlight Forum on Republicans' extreme war on women's reproductive freedom ahead of the 4th anniversary of the Dobbs decision. Donald Trump may want to brush his extreme effort to curtail women's reproductive rights under the rug, but we won't let him. On the campaign trail in 2024, Donald Trump said, "Women won't be thinking about abortion," he said, if he got elected. But the truth is that they have to think about it more than ever before because of this awful decision. Ever since the Dobbs decision 4 years ago, Republicans have been working round the clock to restrict access to abortion care. Today, we're going to hear from people who have been forced to live with the consequences of the Republican radical assault on women's reproductive freedom, and we'll discuss how we're fighting back. We're going to remind Donald Trump that women haven't stopped thinking about his efforts to take away their rights. They're mad as hell. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Majority Whip.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, 1 year ago, Republicans passed the Working Families Tax Cuts law. It's landmark legislation. It helped put more money in people's pockets. That's just about every American working family has benefited. Today, I want to talk about the impact of the Working Families Tax Cuts law on American energy. This new law marks a dramatic shift in America's energy policy. America has now stopped apologizing for producing the energy that our nation needs. Energy is called the master resource, and we are unleashing it once again. Today, America has become the largest energy producer in the world. We produce more oil than the next two nations, the biggest producers, combined. We produce as much natural gas as the next three largest countries combined. And we have more clean coal than any other nation in the world. We're also living in a time of cutting-edge nuclear technology. America is blessed with boundless gifts when it comes to energy. And when we use all of our energy resources wisely, as we do, America wins. The Biden administration got energy completely wrong. Joe Biden told his cabinet to prioritize climate over energy that was available, affordable, and reliable. Democrats closed federal lands to new energy production. Democrats raised taxes on energy producers. Democrats force-fed Americans electric vehicles that people didn't want and couldn't afford. Democrats handed out billions of dollars in subsidies to green energy companies, and these are companies that would never survive without government handouts. So what were the results? Under Joe Biden, families and businesses paid more for energy. Energy workers in Wyoming and across the country lost good-paying jobs. America grew more dependent on foreign nations for energy that we could and should be producing ourselves. The Working Families Tax Cuts law cleared the way for American energy dominance. The Working Families Tax Cuts law opens more energy production onshore, offshore, and in Alaska. That includes oil and gas as well as clean coal. This is a major change from the Biden administration. Joe Biden presided over the fewest energy lease sales since President Harry Truman. Republicans are strengthening U.S. energy production. We're streamlining burdensome regulations. At the same time, we are protecting federal lands. The Working Families Tax Cuts law repealed the Biden-era tax on natural gas. This saves American families money when they try to cool their home this summer. The new law also lowered the tax rate for coal production on federal land. This matters enormously in my home state of Wyoming. Our Powder River Basin produces nearly half of the coal in America. Coal means good-paying jobs in our state. It means revenue for our schools. It means affordable, available, reliable power for millions upon millions of Americans. Now producing clean coal is more competitive. Republicans promised to unleash American energy and lower costs, and we have done it. That's what the Working Families Tax Cuts law did when we passed it a year ago, and it continues to do it today. Every single Democrat in this chamber voted against the Working Families Tax Cuts law. They voted to raise taxes by $4 trillion. Every Democrat voted to keep high taxes on natural gas. They voted to keep American energy trapped in the ground. If the Democrats had their way, American families would be paying more for everything. We need to protect the energy progress that we have made with the Working Families Tax Cut law. Democrats want to go backwards. They've said it. We must not impose new government mandates that raise costs for American families. America's small refineries are the unsung heroes of affordable American energy. Washington, D.C. often overlooks them. Working families depend upon them. And I represent several of those small refineries that are in Wyoming. The refineries employ thousands of people. They make gasoline prices more affordable. They strengthen our nation's energy security. And proposed new mandates on small refineries would harm them and harm the people who work there. Republicans spent the last year cutting taxes and removing barriers to energy production. we should not spend the next few months imposing costly new mandates on American refineries. Americans want, need, and deserve energy that is affordable, available, and reliable. It's good for our workers, it's good for our economy, and it is good for the safety and security of our nation. We as this nation are an energy superpower. And with the Working Families Tax Cut law, we are actually acting like it again. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator Washington.
Mr. President, the attack on vote by mail and other efforts to disenfranchise Americans, whether it's the SAVE Act or redistricting to take away representation from minority-majority districts as the result of the Supreme Court decision in Louisiana versus Calais, all of these are actions to take away the right to vote. Voting in America is a right. It is your right to vote. And for too long, that precious right has been denied to too many. Americans have been beaten, they've been bloodied, and some have given their lives just to secure this right to vote. Women had to fight for it in 1920. It's amazing that I stand here today just a little over 100 years later, but 100 years ago, I would not even been allowed to vote. Wars have been fought to preserve it. My father and uncle both fought in World War II, and I guarantee you they were fighting for our right to vote. And even in this chamber, we had to fight to preserve and certify the 2020 election. So when we are talking about voting rights, we are not talking about an abstract idea. In Pennsylvania in 1871, a man named Octavius Cotto walked towards a polling place in the city of Philadelphia. He was a black educator, a Civil War militia officer, and a respected civic leader. He believed that the promise written into our Constitution after the Civil War, the promise that black Americans would be citizens and voters, ought to mean that something in the streets of his own city, he could cast a vote. On election day, he thought that is what citizens were supposed to do, so he went to vote. He never came home. He was gunned down in broad daylight by a white assailant amid a storm of racially charged violence designed to drive black voters away from the polling place. His killing was not random. It was part of a campaign of terror, a message that to every black citizen, if you dare to exercise your political power, if you dare to walk to that ballot box, you will pay with your life. Nearly a century later in Mississippi in 1966, the tactics had changed, but the target was the same. Black Americans who insisted on their right to vote. Vernon Dahmer, Sr., was a black farmer and businessman. If he dared to exercise his rights, what would happen? Black Americans insisted on their vote, and Dahmer was a black farmer who led his local NAACP branch and understood that a poll tax, a fee that poor people could not afford, was being used as a weapon to keep black people off the voting rolls. So he made a simple, courageous pledge. No one would be denied the chance to register because they could not afford to pay the tax. He went on radio and told people of Mississippi that he would personally help pay their poll tax at his store. The response was not a policy debate. It was terror. In January of that year, the Ku Klux Klan firebombed his home while his family slept inside. Vernon Dahmer fought back long enough to get his wife and children to safety, but he did not survive. He died from the burns and smoke inhalation because he had taken a public stand that poor black citizens should be allowed to be registered and vote. And while the bombs and bullets are no longer used today, the intent to silence certain voters has not disappeared. It has just changed form. Disenfranchisement today is more bureaucratic, it's more technical, but the results for ordinary citizens can be the same. Their voices are shunned out of a democracy. In Texas, in 2021, a new law, SB 1, rewrote the rules for voting by mail. It required voters to provide specific ID numbers on applications and ballot envelopes. The rules were confusing, the process was unforgiving, And in the next primary, thousands of longtime voters, many of them elderly, disabled, or from communities of color, found that their ballot requests or their ballots themselves were rejected. Not because they were ineligible, but really because a form and the number on the form did not match. Researchers working the Brennan Center describe one such voter, a Texan in her 70s. She had done exactly what was asked. She had voted by mail reliably in 2016 and 2018 and in the 2020 general elections. She had played by the rules as they were explained to her then under the new law, but her 2022 ballot was rejected. No one threatened her at the polls with a gun, no one burned her home, but instead a notice informed her that her ballot did not count. Her voice had been quietly erased. And now we know that voters in her situation are far less likely to turn out in the next election. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was necessary because a century after the 15th Amendment, voters of color were still facing systematically blocked from ballots or literary tests, poll tax, or just plain intimidation. Before 1965, Southern states in particular used these tactics to ensure that black citizens would not register to vote, and everywhere where the majority of the population. The Voting Rights Act was needed because early civil rights laws had proven too weak. Congress needed to say explicitly in those laws that what we needed to affirm, Congress said the federal government should oversee elections as it relates to pre-clearance of voting changes in those histories and places of discrimination. Why was this important? Just like all civil liberties that aren't implemented by the states, yes, the federal government should step in and make sure your civil rights and civil liberties are upheld. But some people here in this body don't believe in implementing those. And even though the Senate, this body, reauthorized the Voting Rights Act 98-0 in 2006, the Supreme Court has eroded the gains of the Voting Rights Act over the last decade. So why are we here fighting today? Because today Democrats are opposed to an unconstitutional executive order, a U.S. Postal Service rulemaking, and other efforts by the administration to enable the federal government to seize control over voter rolls and the vote-by-mail system. The administration's actions are unconstitutional. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution gives the states the primary responsibility of administering the elections. Congress has the secondary role. The president has no role. The framers of the Constitution were deliberate about this. The Constitution entrusts the elections to the states so that they can't be manipulated by a self-interested executive branch. In the state of Washington, on a bipartisan basis, vote by mail was implemented more than 40 years ago. By 2011, the state legislature made vote by mail the statewide standard of all elections. And yes, we're talking about a lot of Western states that are in the same boat. Washington was second only to Oregon, which adopted vote by mail in 1998. Today, there are 36 states that use no excuse vote by mail. That means 36 states say you can get a ballot to cast your vote, and you don't have to make up an excuse like you're working or in the hospital or going to be out of the country. You can just request a mail-in ballot. In 2024, voting for president in South Dakota, 35.6% voted by mail. In Indiana, the number was 53%. And in Utah, over 91% of people voted by mail in 2024. I don't remember President Trump questioning the results of those elections. The fact is, many election officials in these states are calling on other states to adopt this very secure, very traceable voting system. Voting by mail is not only convenient, it actually encourages civic participation, And research by the University of Southern California found that universal vote by mail increased turnouts among registered voters by 5.6% in the 2020 election. Other research shows that these numbers could be somewhere between 4 and 10% for seniors and the disabled. So giving people the right to vote is actually helping. And it's no surprise that seniors, 40% of seniors are the ones voting by mail. But somehow we want to disenfranchise them. In the 2024 presidential election, 47 million people, about 1 in 3 US citizens, cast their ballots by mail. And 40% of the Americans 65 and older did so, the highest rate of any group. So we've already said it's safe, it's secure, it's reliable. And among the 89,991,893 ballots cast in my state from 2008 to 2025, so really a 16-year period of time, the Heritage Foundation only found 5 cases of voter fraud, 5 cases in 16 years. In the state of Washington, we verify every voter, every election with 100% signature matching, barcodes, a paper trail, and an ID number if you want to track it yourself. But last December, the US Postal Service changed the location where your mail is postmarked. Instead of postmarking your mail where you drop it off at the post office, your mail isn't postmarked until it's processed at a regional distribution center. This can delay postmarking up to several days. For example, following the changes in the postmark practices, the Secretary of the State of Washington is seeing increased numbers of return ballots being rejected for late postmarks. For example, during the 2026 February special election, 75% of the total rejected ballots were due to late postmarks. Snohomish County, Washington, recently conducted a test to assess the postal delivery times in their area. This was a small test, 4 dates in January and February during a special election, a tiny sample of voters in one county. But of the sample ballots mailed, only about 20% were postmarked on the day they were actually mailed. 20%. Are we saying we are going to allow 20% of voters who vote by mail to be disenfranchised because this administration is trying to force the Postal Service to say they are not going to stamp your ballot on the date that you mail it at the post office? What about your Social Security check? What about other things that you would like to see postmarked the day they are mailed? What about legal documents? What about other issues? No. We are promulgating here a story of mischief that doesn't need to be here to suppress voters. On Election Day, only about half of the 15 test mailings were postmarked that day. This month, the Postal Service issued a proposed rule to take control of who can receive a ballot and whose vote will be counted if you vote by mail. This is preposterous. They want to use a Department of Homeland Security database notorious for erroneously finding eligible voters to be ineligible. That's right, that's what can happen to you. All of a sudden, now your name is on a database and you're ineligible even though you're really eligible. On Election Day, about half of the postmarks were postmarked that day. Let me say this again. The post office is reasserting it can decide who gets a ballot, and they would decide who can cast a ballot by mail. Fortunately, yesterday, a federal court blocked the use of the DHS database, at least for now, as a violation of every American's privacy. But that litigation is continuing. And yesterday, the Postal Service declined to provide a witness to testify in the state of Washington at our state legislative committee about this issue. Why? If you're so proud of these tactics, if you think they're so great, why don't you show up at the Washington state legislature and testify about what is happening? With the administration's plan, if you are among 1/3 of Americans that vote by mail, you can never know whether your vote was counted. There is no recourse. I asked my colleagues, this is an assault on your right to vote. This is an assault on having your voice heard. Whether it is a new rule delaying when the postmark is prohibited and counting ballots but received later, whether it's demanding the DHS continue to purge names, they just want to take your rights away. Last week, over 100 FBI agents raided the Ohio voting rights group, the Ohio Organizing Collaborative, searching their offices, taking computers, knocking on the doors of volunteers without subpoena. A few days later, the FBI went after one of the nation's leading nonprofit voter outreach coordination hubs, America Votes, a DC-based organization that works to turn out voters nationwide. They went after American Votes because it is among the voter organization that funds the Ohio Organizing Collaborative. America Votes works with 400 organizations, including the AFL-CIO, Human Rights Campaign, Planned Parenthood, Emily's List, and the American Federation of Teachers to educate voters and get out the votes. It is an outrage that Kash Patel is sending FBI agents to intimidate advocacy groups that work hard to turn out voters, particularly those of color. My family has always fought to get out the vote. My parents lived and worked alongside people like Robert F. Kennedy and knew of Martin Luther King's voice. Martin Luther King Jr. on a trip to Seattle said, "Are we going to be, quote, an echo rather than a voice, a taillight instead of a headlight?" When I think about what we are seeing today, I see the same thing for my colleagues over here. Are you going to be an echo for the Trump administration about this ludicrous idea of the SAFE Act? Are you going to be an echo for this ludicrous idea that our states that have vote by mail may all of a sudden now be subject to what the President, Homeland Security, and their enforcement of the post office is going to do to our ballots? Or are you going to be a headlight for the future of our country and the future of our democracy? I ask my colleagues to stand up for your vote, your constituents' votes, and for our rights. Because if we don't stop this, I guarantee you, millions of Americans will be disenfranchised. And our future is much brighter with a system that allows for millions of people in my state, 80% sometimes, of voters to vote, and do so with certainty and to follow their ballot. Let's not let this 2026 election be stolen by people who want to get rid of the rules that we have lived by. Too many of those people that I mentioned died to get this, or the women who fought in 1920 to preserve it, or the people who have fought in wars to make sure that we have this privilege and right. Let's hold on to it. I thank the President, and I yield the floor.
Senator Virginia.
Mr. President, I rise today to address a very serious topic, one that I've often addressed on the floor of the Senate during my 13-plus years here, but that I've particularly been focused on since President Trump decided to launch a war against Iran on February 28 of this year. And the issue is whether we should ever be at war without a vote of Congress. The consequences of the war that President Trump started are pretty well known to the American public. We have now spent in excess of $50 billion of U.S. taxpayer money on the war, with the need to spend more to replenish munitions stockpiles and repair infrastructure that has been damaged by Iran, U.S. infrastructure in the nations near that country. More important than the dollars we've lost are the lives that have been lost. 13 U.S. troops, including a Virginian Warrant Officer, Robert Marzon, have lost their lives in this war. and thousands of Iranian civilians have been killed. The damage has not just been to the U.S. Treasury and taxpayers and to our troops and Iranian civilians. It's also been to everyday American families. Because of the instability in the war, the Straits of Hormuz were closed, as all predicted it might be if President Trump launched this war, and that has led to escalating fuel prices. The estimates are that Americans have paid already $50 billion more for fuel since February 28 than they would have if President Trump had not started this war. I could go on about the consequences now being 110 days or so into this war, but I don't think I need to, because I think the American public understands them very well. But I'm here today to rise again, as I have beginning within the first few days of the war, essentially every week, to ask my colleagues to do what the Constitution says we should do and direct the president to cease hostilities against Iran until Congress authorizes a war. The most solemn power, in my view, in Article 1 of the Constitution, the most solemn power for Congress is Congress has the power to declare war, not the president. That was done very deliberately as the Constitution was drawn up in 1787 in Philadelphia, because the delegates to the Constitutional Convention believed, even with someone as talented as George Washington ready to assume the presidency of the United States, that the stakes and consequences of war were so vast that a decision about war should never be in the hands of a single person, but instead should be vested in the legislative branch, so that a decision about sending our best and brightest, our kids, into war, and the presiding officer, our president, knows more about the real costs of war than virtually anybody in this chamber, that before we send our best and brightest into war, it should be based upon a very careful and deliberate debate in full view of the American public so they can understand the stakes. And then war can be initiated once Congress has decided this is in the national interest. Congress has not done this with respect to the war in Iran, and that's not unusual. Congress has often abdicated this responsibility over the years, but we take an oath to a Constitution that brooks no end running on this, that Congress has to own this responsibility. And so I rise again today for the 10th or 11th time. We've tried to have this vote virtually every week on the floor of the Senate to say no war in Iran unless Congress, by vote, approves it. In the earlier votes we've had, we've been voting, Mr. President, on Senate resolutions, and most of the resolutions have failed, although they have failed narrowly. There was one positive vote on a resolution that I put forward, and it was a motion to discharge that resolution from committee that actually passed the Senate by a 50-47 vote. There were some absences that day, but it did pass. And so my resolution is still pending on the floor, but that is not the resolution we're going to be voting on today. After lunch, I will ask to be pulled up a House concurrent resolution. The Republican majority House has passed a resolution saying, Mr. President, no war in Iran without a vote of Congress. And this afternoon, I will not be pulling up a Senate resolution, which, if successful, would have to go to the House. Instead, I'm pulling up the concurrent resolution that the House has already acted upon. Why is this vote different than the earlier ones we've had? Well, I've already explained procedurally it's a bit different because we're taking up the House concurrent resolution, but that may not necessarily be a difference maker as people try to decide how to vote. Let me talk about why this vote is different than the earlier votes in terms of the merits of the case, the merits of saying right now to the president, no more war without a vote of Congress. The first difference is with each day, the consequences of the war become more apparent. We're acting with more knowledge. Even since the vote we had last week, we now have the administration has come to us with a supplemental request asking for $80 billion more, largely necessitated by the consequences of the war, to replenish munition stockpiles and take other actions that wouldn't fully repair damages, for example, that the Pentagon has incurred, but would start to. So we have some more information than last week. The second thing we have is I think we have more information about where members of this body are. Many of us believe the war was foolish and illegal and never should have been started. Many of us believe the memorandum of understanding that was revealed last week is insufficient. Many of us believe both of those things are true. In fact, I've been trying to monitor the comments of my Senate colleagues, and I would venture to say that about 2/3 of the senators, maybe even higher now, have either expressed their belief that the war should never have been waged or their belief that the MOU is inadequate. And so now we know a little bit more about where this body is, and that is also based upon each day brings more information. The terms of the MOU weren't completely available and hadn't been scrutinized the last time we had this vote. But the most important thing, Mr. President, I think that's different about this vote than some of the earlier votes is, thank God we're in a ceasefire, a fragile one. And the ceasefire is a bit of an intermission where we get to step back, and we should step back. And as Congress engage on the question of what is the next step. This effort to cease hostilities is not coming in the midst of active back and fire kinetic action between the United States and Iran or Iran and allies. It's a fragile ceasefire, and it is interrupted, but we've stepped back from the most active phase of the war, and that's a perfect time for Congress to step back and ask ourselves the question of what should the next chapter be, rather than allowing one man to make that decision. In fact, Mr. President, it's interesting. I was thinking about this as I walked over this morning. What are the options right now? The options are either a negotiated peace deal or potentially returning to war. If the Trump administration negotiates a deal that includes anything about the Iran nuclear program, they have to bring it to Congress, pursuant to the Iran Nuclear Review Act that I helped co-author about 10 years ago. So in the event of diplomacy, the administration must come to Congress. If the administration wants more money for the war, they must come to Congress. They sent over a supplemental request last week. So if the administration has to come to Congress and engage us, if diplomacy is the chapter, if they have to come to Congress and engage us if more dollars are needed, we shouldn't say, but you don't have to come to us if you just want to restart the war. How odd would it be that they would need our permission for diplomacy and need our permission for dollars, but not need our permission to start bombing again? And I think that odd disharmony, that cognitive dissonance, demonstrates the wisdom of the framers giving the power to declare war to Congress. If you have to come to us for diplomacy and you have to come to us for money, you shouldn't be able to end-run us to initiate war on our own. And so after lunch, I will make the motion to pull up this House concurrent resolution. I'm unaware of an earlier instance of this being done, but it is in accord with Senate procedure to pull up a House concurrent resolution and seek a vote on it. And it is my hope that with the experience of these 100+ days and the knowledge of the consequences and the magnitude of these issues to American families, Congress will stand and deliver on the oath we have taken that the nation should not be at war unless Congress authorizes it. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator Maryland.
Mr. President, I want to start by saluting my colleague, the senator for Virginia, Senator Kaine, for his steadfast adherence to the Constitution of the United States and Congress's role in that Constitution, especially as it relates to war powers. And I rise today in support of this resolution and in support of ending this disastrous and illegal war that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu launched over 100 days ago. Nearly 4 months into this illegal and reckless war, the American people have already paid too high a price. There's no good way out of a bad war. But when you're digging yourself into a hole, the best way out is to stop digging. The debate before us is not a question of whether the MOU signed by the United States and Iran is perfect, but rather the debate is about whether continuing the war would make things better. And it is clear that continuing this disastrous war will only make things even worse, not better. The terms of this agreement reflect the reality that many of us warned about before this war even began. We warned that military action would not achieve the grand strategic objectives its advocates promised. In fact, you could tell that because there was such confusion within the administration about what the real goals of the war were. We warned that military force would strengthen the more militant elements of the Iranian regime rather than weaken them. We warned that the war would destabilize the region, threaten the global economy, and ultimately leave the people of the United States worse off. And that's exactly what's happened. Over 100 days ago, President Trump, together with Prime Minister Netanyahu, launched the war against Iran without congressional authorization. When he did that, President Trump walked away from diplomatic alternatives. In fact, just hours before launching military action, there was a diplomatic framework being advanced through Omani mediators. Instead of pursuing the diplomatic track, President Trump chose war, just as he previously chose to tear up the JCPOA. That's the agreement that was negotiated by the Obama administration, which had successfully constrained Iran's nuclear program through diplomacy. That diplomatic framework, the JCPOA, placed meaningful constraints on Iran's nuclear program without dragging the United States into another war in the Middle East. It had an extremely vigorous inspection regime so that we could detect any effort by Iran to violate that agreement. In fact, the first Trump administration certified that Iran was in compliance with the terms of that agreement. But shortly after certifying that Iran was in compliance, the first Trump administration, President Trump, his first time in the Oval Office, ripped it up. He just ripped it up. He reimposed sanctions on Iran that had been lifted as part of that agreement. And so, not surprisingly, when President Trump ripped it up, Iran felt it no longer had to abide by its terms, which started us down the path that brings us here. Now, unlike President Obama, President Trump abandoned the effort to get a negotiated solution and joined Prime Minister Netanyahu in starting the war. I think we all remember that candidate Trump told the country, he told the American people, that he would keep us out of wars. He told us he was instead going to focus here at home and bring down prices. Well, he's done exactly the opposite. Started a war, prices are going up. And now, after starting a stupid war, President Trump finally appears to be embracing many of the same underlying principles of diplomacy with Iran that has always been required. Many of us warned that abandoning diplomacy would increase the likelihood of exactly the kind of conflict we have now seen. And we were right. And now, after nearly 4 months of death and destruction, many of the same people in this body who cheered the war on are attacking efforts to end it. And as we discuss a war powers resolution, I think it's important to underscore the fact that many of our Senate colleagues who were cheering on the war still were unwilling to bring forth before the Senate an authorization, a congressional authorization, to support the very war they were cheering on. So they were cheering it on, but refused to take responsibility for putting an authorization on this floor, which is Congress's duty with respect to the Constitution if it wants to go to war. And now some of the same folks who refused to put forward an authorization to support the war they cheered on are doing their very best to try to prevent the war from ending. And that should concern all of us, Mr. President, because every proposal to derail diplomacy ultimately leads back to the same place. It leads back to more war, to more destruction, to more American lives at risk, to more economic turmoil, and billions more taxpayer dollars wasted. Let's talk about what this war has already cost. We should keep this in mind as we listen to some who want to continue this war. It's already cost us the lives of 14 American service members, and hundreds have been wounded. An American Tomahawk missile strike killed more than 150 Iranians in Minab, most of them children. And even months later, questions about that attack remain unanswered. Thousands of other civilians have been killed and injured across Iran. Thousands more have been killed in Lebanon, and 30 civilians have been killed in Israel. All these lives lost. And for what? For what? We are now negotiating arrangements to restore conditions that existed before this war even began, like reopening the Strait of Hormuz, which of course was open the day before this war started. It has been a strategic disaster, and the economic consequences have been felt by every American. According to Moody's Analytics, this war has already cost American consumers and taxpayers about $132 billion. Gas prices have surged, and Americans have spent tens of billions more dollars at the pump than they would have otherwise. Fertilizer prices have increased dramatically, contributing to higher food costs. We just saw inflation jump to the highest level in more than 3 years. The World Bank even downgraded its global economic growth forecast to just 2.5%, the lowest it has been since the pandemic. And the Pentagon tells us it's preparing to request $80 billion in supplemental funding to cover the costs associated with this conflict, a number we expect to be much higher at the end of the day. Now, as I mentioned, President Trump had promised that he was going to stop wars. He promised he was going to lower costs. Instead, he has spent billions of taxpayer dollars on a reckless war of choice while driving up prices here at home. Now, if President Trump and our Republican colleagues had had their priorities straight, they would have invested these monies in behalf of the American people. You could use them to bring down health care costs. You could use them to bring down child costs. If you take even a conservative number of $50 billion for what the war has cost already, and it is much higher than that, but at $50 billion, you could erase the medical debt for every American who was pushed into medical debt because they couldn't afford their health care. So these are the choices the Trump administration made, and this administration prioritized the war instead of making life more affordable for American families. And since the president launched this war without congressional authorization, many members of our body continue to abdicate their constitutional responsibilities with respect to matters of war and peace, probably the most solemn responsibilities given to the Congress in the Constitution. And that's why several of my colleagues and I have repeatedly introduced and called up these war powers resolutions to continue to urge this body to execute our constitutional responsibilities. And now, today, we have before us another opportunity. The House has already acted by passing this concurrent resolution, directing the President to remove U.S. forces from hostilities against Iran. Because while this ceasefire represents progress, it remains tenuous. We all know that. In fact, President Trump yet again threatened to bomb Iran this weekend, contrary to the very first line in the first clause of the MOU that says Iran and the United States will refrain from the threat or use of force against each other. And American troops remain deployed throughout the region. The risks are still present, and the prospect of further escalation remains very real, particularly in Lebanon, where Prime Minister Netanyahu continues to agitate for more war, despite the MOU clearly indicating a halt to the war on all fronts, including Lebanon. In recent days, I'm sure my colleagues have seen that U.S. intelligence agencies have warned the Trump administration that Prime Minister Netanyahu is likely to try to undermine the president's efforts to reach a lasting peace deal with Iran in order to ensure his own political survival in upcoming elections in Israel. Israel's National Security Minister, Ben-Gvir, also said in a social media post a few days after the MOU was signed, quote, "All of Lebanon must burn," unquote. He's not just any member. He's a member of the government, the Netanyahu coalition. And that sort of rhetoric is not new. In March of this year, Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz, said, and I quote, "All homes in Lebanese villages near the border will be destroyed in accordance with the Rafah model in Gaza," unquote. Well, Rafah is a city in southern Gaza near the Egyptian border that was turned into rubble during the war in Gaza. And now you have the Israeli defense minister saying that's the plan for southern Lebanon. Indeed, the Netanyahu government's warmongering has been so blatant that even President Trump and Vice President Vance are publicly admonishing the extremist Israeli government and their blatant attempts to undermine diplomatic efforts to permanently end this war. Mr. President, this agreement is a bow to reality, the terrible reality that many of us predicted would unfold if we started this illegal war in the first place. The war was a blunder. We should recognize that. And America is worse off than before we started. And there is no good way to end a bad war, and we should end it. Those pushing to abandon this agreement owe the American people an answer to a simple question. What's your alternative? What comes next? More lives lost, more money wasted with no path forward? Because that is the only alternative they are offering. I want peace to prevail, and I hope this MOU becomes the foundation of a broader diplomatic settlement. But I also hope, colleagues, we will learn something from this needless tragedy. The calls for military adventurism, the promises of quick victory, the fantasies of regime change under the circumstances that were deployed, and the endless effort to undermine diplomacy led us directly to this disaster. And we should not repeat those mistakes. We should take a stand today and end this war, and we should finally start putting the interests of the American people ahead of costly and unnecessary conflicts. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this war powers resolution, and I yield the floor.
Senator Wisconsin.
Are we in a quorum call?
We are not.
Today, I rise in opposition to Donald Trump's illegal war in Iran. I come to ask a simple question. What has this war gotten us? Here's what we do know. It has tragically cost the lives of 13 service members. It has caused hundreds of others to be injured. It has cost taxpayers tens upon tens of billions of dollars. It has cost the average American more than $250 more at the pump on average. It has cost farmers nearly 50% more on fertilizers. This war has been a disaster, and the American people agree. When the war began, it was the most unpopular war in U.S. history and has only gotten more unpopular as it has gone on. The president clearly gets that. So he has released a 2.5-page bullet point memorandum of understanding that he claims will be the panacea to end the war. Look, ending the war is absolutely a good thing. But with this alleged deal, there are a few major catches. For starters, this flimsy memorandum of understanding agreement has not and will not actually end the war. This is a plan to make a plan later. And what the Trump administration is learning in real time is that a final deal, like the Obama-era deal on Iran, takes hard work. Secondly, this short-term deal has been broken already. Lastly, if it were to be followed to a T, it would be an embarrassing fold to the Iranians and loser for the American people. We would green light $300 billion to go to this hardline Iranian regime. We would lift sanctions on this regime and let it freely sell oil, allowing them to make billions more. We would show that Iran can control the Strait of Hormuz and our global economy whenever it wants. And what do we get? Not much. No freedom for the Iranian people who were protesting a brutal regime mere months ago. No end to Iran's nuclear capabilities. So I again ask, what has this war of choice gotten us? This war has been bad for the American people. And now this off-ramp is bad for the American people. Congress had the opportunity to end this war months ago. And we should have done just that to avoid this exact scenario. My Republican colleagues refused, but that does not mean it's too late. It's clear as day that we cannot trust this president to be left to his own devices. We need to use the power we have to end this war and head down the path of real diplomacy. Let's take it. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this concurrent resolution, and I yield.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
President, I believe there's an order that we recess at 12:30. I'd be asked that I just be allowed to finish my remarks before we recess.
Without objection.
Thank you. Colleagues, over the last year and a half, our president, Donald Trump, has turned the White House into a 24/7 corruption operation. This is a national crisis, and we should start acting like it. The president's goal is to engage in so much corruption, so much self-enrichment, to hand out so many favors to his friends, his family, and his political allies that it just becomes the pitter-patter of rain. It's normal, it's constant, it's never-ending. Trump's bet is that if there's a new story of corruption, of self-dealing, every few days, that the press will stop covering it, or the public will just stop paying attention. To an extent, he is tragically succeeding. But he's also betting that the public will just come to the conclusion that this is normal because all of our politics are this corrupt, that every senator, that every previous president is this corrupt. That is not true. While I disagree with my Senate Republican colleagues' decision to largely remain silent in the face of this misconduct, it is true that not a single senator on either side of the aisle engages in the behavior that our president does. Senators, Republicans and Democrats, do not trade our votes for cash or for political contributions. We don't run side hustles like crypto companies. Senators don't give contracts to their kids just because we can. And no president in the history of this country has done what Donald Trump has done. No president has done 5% of the self-dealing that Donald Trump has done in the last year and a half. This moment is exceptional. It is a one-of-one moment. And if it becomes normal, if people stop being outraged at what he is doing to enrich himself, then I fear there is no going back. The White House will just become a place to get rich. So I think it's time to pull back and see the full picture, to not view this as just one isolated scandal after another, every single one popping up each week or every few days, but to understand the full scope of this illegality. Last year, I came to the floor to document the first 100 days of Donald Trump's mind-blowing corruption. Since then, especially in 2026, the pace of his misconduct has quickened dramatically. And so I'm here on the floor today, and I'm going to spend more than a few minutes doing this, laying out what has happened since I gave that last speech. This is the story of 500 days of corruption. And I'm going to start on April 7th, 2025. This is when the current acting Attorney General, Todd Blanche, issues a memo ordering the termination of several Biden-era DOJ investigations into crypto companies. Now, here's the problem. The then Deputy Attorney General is a major investor in crypto companies, and he works for a president who is a major player in the crypto industry. But DOJ just drops these investigations, signals that the Department of Justice is no longer going to hold crypto companies accountable. But Blanche owns major investments in crypto stocks. The president is one of the biggest players in the industry. Blanche doesn't actually stop there. He eliminates the entire enforcement team at DOJ dedicated to rooting out crypto-related fraud and money laundering schemes. This is a crypto investor who works for a president who owns crypto companies, shutting down the unit at DOJ that holds this industry accountable. Let's move to 3 weeks later, on April 30th. Later in the month, a curious announcement from the Department of Agriculture. They are reversing a rule that would require poultry companies to limit salmonella bacteria levels in their products. This is essentially a rule to make it less likely that people will get salmonella poisoning. It sounds like a strange rule to eliminate. We come to find out that one of the biggest donors to Donald Trump's inauguration was a poultry company called Pilgrim's Pride. They made a donation to Trump's inauguration that was bigger than practically any other company, bigger than Amazon, Meta, or Exxon, $5 million. And after they made the donation, they asked for one thing, the reversal of this salmonella rule, and they got it. This is pay for play. You make a donation to the president or the president's political operation, you ask for a favor, and you get it. And we will see as we wind through these 500 days, this happens over and over again. In May 2005, the pardon racket starts. Every member of the Senate should be outraged at this. You all know what is happening. The president is pardoning people based on their ability to pay, either him and his political operation, or pay people who are close to the president. On May 27th, Donald Trump pardons a man called Paul Walzak. This is a really bad guy. He stole millions of dollars from the nurses and healthcare aides at the nursing home he owned. And he used the cash that he stole from his employees to buy a $2 million yacht. He got convicted. He went to jail for fraud. But his mother paid $1 million to buy a face-to-face meeting with Donald Trump. And 3 weeks after that paid audience, her son was given a full and unconditional pardon that went so far as to relieve him of any duty to pay back the $4.4 million that he stole from his employees. This is a new pay for pardons scheme that begins in May. In June of 2025, it's revealed that top administration officials are cashing in on government contracts that benefit their own investment portfolio. Stephen Miller is more than just the architect of the administration's hardline immigration policies. He has a personal financial stake in them. For instance, Miller owns up to $250,000 in Palantir stock. And just a month before Miller's holdings became public, ICE announced that it was awarding a $30 million contract to, you guessed it, Palantir, to provide real-time surveillance information to ICE officers. And you'll be shocked to hear this, there was no competitive bidding process for that contract. And you'll hear this over and over again. Competitive bidding basically doesn't exist. If the president or somebody close to the president wants a contract directed to a friend or to a company in which they invest. Miller overseeing ICE. ICE gives a no-bid contract to Palantir. The investors in Palantir, which include Stephen Miller, get rich. Let's move to September of 2025. In September, we start to learn the danger of Donald Trump's crypto corruption. I covered this in the first 100 days of corruption. This is maybe the most corrupt thing that Trump is doing. He and his family own a crypto company that issues several crypto coins. There's no disclosure on who is buying those coins. The president promotes them. He invites people to official events who purchase the coin. On September 18th, though, we come to find out that Trump made $57 million selling crypto tokens to entities associated with the regimes in North Korea, Iran, and Russia. Extraordinary investments being made by entities that are tied in with North Korea, Iran, and Russia into Trump's crypto companies. It begs the question, as we are currently debating an Iran deal that basically exists on Iran's terms, Why was there a flood of money from Iranian regime-backed entities into the Trump crypto companies? Why were they putting that investment in? What did they expect to get from the president? We've never, ever before had this exist. We've never had a backdoor mechanism by which foreign governments could just shovel money into the pocket of the president. It exists because of Trump's meme coin and his stable coin. On September 23rd, this is a week later, it's now pretty obvious that there's a pay-to-play regime in charge of the White House. A week later, on September 23rd, Donald Trump closes the books on a criminal investigation into one of his key advisors, Tom Homan. This is his border czar. The FBI had caught Tom Homan red-handed, engaging in naked corruption. Undercover agents had handed him $50,000 in cash, in a bag, and he agreed to give them government contracts. This was on video. This is the border czar getting a bag of cash in exchange for contracts on video, but the administration on September 20th just makes the investigation go away because that kind of bribery, that kind of naked graft is okay in this White House. We're moving on to October 2025 right now, 2 weeks after Homan is let off. Maybe the most nakedly corrupt pardon. There's not a single senator that could launch his crypto business. So who cares about financing terrorists and sex criminals? Trump gives this guy a full pardon on October 7th. It's naked. This is a guy who built a company that allowed terrorists and sex predators to engage in private financing. He went to jail. He got out of jail because he agreed to help get Trump rich. We're still in October. Later that month, the bulldozers arrived to destroy the East Wing of the White House. It's still amazing to think that that actually happened. And the ballroom corruption racket begins. The word goes out, if you want something from Donald Trump, donate to his ballroom. It's all he cares about. We know that. Donald Trump talks about his ballroom all the time. As of this month, more than half of the publicly identified donors to the Ballroom Project have, since they made their donation, won a new or expanded federal contract, totaling more than $50 billion. More than half of the people who donated to the Ballroom have, since they donated, and this just all kicked off on October 15th. This has only been like 8 months. Half of the people who donated to the Ballroom have gotten a new or expanded federal contract worth $50 billion. Moving on to November of 2025. It's not just Trump's corporate donors that are getting rich now. Part of the White House's daily operation is to find creative ways to funnel taxpayer money to Trump's kids. This one's wild. The Trump administration in November, early November, announces a really unusual deal. The government, the Pentagon, is taking a $50 million stake in a single rare earths minerals company called Vulcan Elements and giving them a $620 million taxpayer-funded loan. That is big money. And the Pentagon doesn't really do deals like this. But they do when Donald Trump Jr. is one of the company's key investors. We come to find out that civil servants in the Pentagon did not want to do this deal, only did it because the White House told them to do the deal. One official said, quote, "The call came from the White House. We have to get this done." Before the deal, Vulcan was worth $200 million. Donald Trump Jr. made an investment. His father got the Pentagon to give them the contract and buy the stake in the company, and the valuation jumped overnight $200 million to $2 billion. Donald Trump Jr. 10x'd his profits. I mean, how does anybody in this body justify that? You've probably not even heard that story. It barely cracked the news. Like in normal times, that scandal alone, the president's son making an investment in the company, the federal government then making a massive investment subsequently, the Pentagon didn't want to do it, only did it because the president told them to do it after his son made the investment, and the value of the president's son's investment went up by 10 times. That scandal alone would take down a presidency. This one barely gets noticed. 3 days later, news breaks that Trump has ordered all the markets in U.S. Coast Guard bases and facilities to stock his personally branded wine and cider, directly profiting from his control over the military. Tells the Coast Guard, sell my products. That's it. That's not a complicated one. That's just like ordinary ho-hum corruption. Nobody even knows that that happened, that exists, because this all feels normal now. We are not out of November yet, fellas. 2 weeks later, you feel this, right? The pace now is quickening. Trump releases the head of a nursing home empire, Joseph Schwartz, from prison. This guy, similar to the other guy, scammed his patients, his employees, and the IRS out of tens of millions of dollars. He was a tax cheat. People died in his facilities due to his negligence. He was just stealing money from his nursing homes. But he paid $1 million to Trump-connected lobbyists. And Trump pardoned this fraudster after serving 3 months. There was no claim that he was innocent. There was no claim that the trial was rigged. No, this guy was convicted of massive fraud. He hurt people, and he got out of jail because he paid the right lobbyists who were connected to Trump. This is how it all works. It's not just Trump getting rich. It's not just Trump's sons getting rich. It's about everybody connected to the president getting rich. This pardon for cash scheme. All right, we're into December now. 2 weeks later, out of the blue, the Trump administration revokes a Biden-era rule, this is back to nursing homes, to ensure that nursing homes have sufficient staffing to meet the basic standards of care. We have a lot of evidence that understaffed nursing homes have higher mortality rates, but this rule is now rescinded. And guess what we find out? We find out that nursing home executives got together, paid to have a private lunch with Donald Trump, because remember, you can pay millions of dollars to Trump-affiliated political entities, and you will get a private audience with them. At lunch, they asked him to revoke this rule, and he immediately ordered it done. No public discussion, no consideration of the merits. The nursing home executives paid the price to get a lunch. They asked for the rule to be rescinded, and the rules got rescinded. No process, had the lunch, paid the money, asked for the rule to be rescinded. Trump called up, and the rule was rescinded. We're now in 2026. On February 10th, Trump announces that this one's wild. He announces on February 10th that he is blocking the opening of a bridge that is ready to open connecting Detroit to Canada. It's ready to open. This is a bridge that's going to help people on both sides of the border. And guess what we find out? The owner of an existing bridge, whose profits would be harmed by the competitor bridge, donated $1 million to get a meeting, this time with Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick. And this isn't within days this time, within hours of the meeting with the Commerce Secretary. Hours. The owners of the existing bridge got what they wanted. Trump announced that he would block the opening of the bridge. $1 million, a meeting, and a donor gets what they want within hours. The next month, we start to see that Trump's inner circle knows that they can get in on the action. Very few people are closer to President Trump than Corey Lewandowski. And he is, at the time, the special advisor to the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. And Lewandowski is basically like, there are no rules anymore. I can do whatever I want. And so he literally starts to engage in mob-style extortion threats to contractors. He demands direct payments from companies that want DHS contracts for his protection. If you pay me money, I will protect your contracts. And there's plenty of evidence here from the companies themselves who tell the story of when they refuse to pay Lewandowski for protection, mob-style protection, suddenly their contracts from DHS dry up. A DHS employee confirmed that he received direct instructions to not give a company that didn't pay Lewandowski any more contracts. In April, another scheme to help Donald Trump's kids. For almost 100 years, it has been illegal to ship handguns through the mail because it's a lot easier for violent criminals to illegally access guns if they can just get those weapons shipped to their front door. But Donald Trump Jr. bought a huge stake in a company that was going to corner the market on the mail order sale of guns. And so Trump's DOJ got to work and declared that this 100-year-old law is magically, all of a sudden, unconstitutional, clearing the way for another company owned or invested in by Donald Trump Jr. to make big bucks by mailing guns. We're still in April. As the war begins in Iran, Trump's inner circle finds a new way to cash in. They can place bets on prediction markets or in futures markets based on the inside information they have about the war. This is illegal war profiteering. Hours before Trump announces the first Iran ceasefire, a bunch of investors, likely inside the White House, placed approximately $950 million on bets that oil prices would fall. When later that day, Trump announced the ceasefire that sent oil prices tumbling by 15%, those investors got filthy rich. You can literally look at the pace of trades that day. There's this avalanche of trades that happen hours before Trump announces the ceasefire. That can only be because people had inside information. This practice would continue to happen over and over and over. But why do they think they can get away with this? Why does anybody think that they can get away with this? So much of this is illegal, right? You would say to yourself, nobody would engage in that kind of naked illegal practice. Nobody would award contracts to the kids knowing that that doesn't pass legal muster. On April 10th, you figure out why they think they're going to get away with it. On April 10th, Donald Trump makes an explicit promise that everybody engaged in this corruption will get away with it. Here is his quote on April 10th, as the pace of this corruption increases. Quote, "I will pardon everyone within 200 feet of the White House." So now you understand why people think they can get away with it. This is reported on April 27th, so we're still in April. Trump wants to get all his friends involved in the grift now. So Trump gives a no-bid $17 million contract to refurbish 2 fountains near the White House, including the reflecting pool. We're living with the consequences of this corruption right now, as we have a green reflecting pool. This is a completely unqualified contractor who is already in over his head because he's involved in the ballroom, and he gets a new $17 million contract. Does it really cost $17 million to clean up fountains? The answer from the National Park Service itself is no. In fact, the National Park Service was planning to bid that contract out for 1/5 what Trump gave it to his friend for. But it was a no-bid contract. It just went to Donald Trump's friend. The value was wildly inflated. And so now Trump's buddy has an extra $14 million, more than the actual cost of the project. It's your money. This money doesn't grow on trees. This is taxpayer money. It's supposed to cost $3 million. He gave the contract for $17 million. We're still in April. Big Tobacco has wanted for years to break into the $6 billion flavored vape and e-cigarette market. But the FDA, of course, has had regulations to say that you can't sort of run back this old playbook of the tobacco companies marketing to kids. So we haven't allowed them to market these flavored vape products, these bubblegum flavored vape products. I have 2 teenagers. I know exactly what's going on. They are marketing these products to kids, and they weren't allowed to do it. But the tobacco lobbyists did the thing that we've talked about over and over again. They made a $5 million donation, and if you make a $5 million donation, you get a lunch with the president or a dinner with the president. So they get this lunch with the president, and they say to the president, just like the nursing homes executive said, I want the vape rule to be rescinded. Surrounded by these big tobacco representatives, President Trump, like at the moment, calls the FDA commissioner and tells them to rescind the regulations. He calls up Dr. Oz. Like, all this is happening immediately. Tells him to rescind the regulations. The FDA commissioner resigns in protest. He said, in good conscience, he couldn't do this. He couldn't be part of this kind of corruption. But on Friday, the FDA announced that it was bypassing all traditional rulemaking to adopt the exact policy that the tobacco executives asked for the weekend before. Less than a week. Less than a week. No rulemaking. FDA commissioner resigns. We're now on to May. Not all the stories of the corruption in this White House require deep journalistic dives into obscure public records. Sometimes you can just log on to YouTube, where you can find the Secretary of Transportation, Sean Duffy's family road trip reality show. Who is bankrolling this stunt? Who's paying for the gas, the hotels, the cameras, filming his vacation? Not Duffy. It's Toyota, it's Boeing, it's United Airlines. It's all the companies that Secretary Duffy is responsible for regulating. Gas prices are going up, transportation costs are going up, and the Secretary of Transportation is riding in snowmobiles in Montana paid for by the companies he regulates. Decades ago, that scandal alone, companies you regulate paying for your vacations, would have resulted in a cabinet member resigning in disgrace. My Republican colleagues know this. This didn't used to be acceptable. But in Trump's White House, everyone has their hand out for a payday. It's encouraged. And then finally in May, we discover another monster corruption scheme. The market bets based on inside information have not, in fact, been limited to Trump's staff and friends. The entire time that Trump has been in office, we discover, he has not been putting his money into a blind trust. He has been personally signing off on thousands and thousands of individual trades. No previous president has done this. Here's an example of how it works. Early in the year, Trump buys $1 million of Dell stock. A couple days later, from the White House podium, he boosts the company, Dell, that he just bought stock in. A couple months later, he gives Dell a $10 billion defense contract with the Pentagon. That happens over and over again. The president buys stock, he publicly boosts the company, he gives government work. I know all this feels exhausting, 500 days of corruption, but we've never, ever seen this before. I only listed like half of the publicly disclosed incidents of corruption. And we just can't pretend that this is normal. I'm giving a half an hour to this because this is a serious, serious crisis. The pay-to-play schemes, the pardons for donors, the contracts for friends, the favors for Trump's children, the use of inside information to make money. This is not a disconnected series of scandals. This is a system. Government is supposed to serve us. It is supposed to lower costs. It's supposed to protect our families, strengthen our schools, make life better for people. But Donald Trump believes that government exists to serve him, to make him richer, to protect his friends, to reward his donors. This is why he doesn't have time for you. He doesn't have time to solve real problems because he's making money for himself and his friends. And he's betting that the corruption will be so constant that we stop hearing it, that the outrage will just turn into exhaustion, and the exhaustion will just turn into acceptance. We can't let that happen, because once corruption becomes normal, it becomes permanent. The White House is not a business opportunity. The presidency is not a license to steal from the American people. The government of the United States doesn't exist to make Donald Trump rich. It belongs to the American people. And after 500 days of corruption, Democrats and Republicans in this body, along with the American people, should start acting like it. I yield the floor.
Senator from Idaho.
Mr. President, today we have before us House Concurrent Resolution number 86. That is the item of business. Well, first of all, I ask unanimous consent to speak for up to 5 minutes before the previously scheduled recess. Thank you, Mr. President. I'm going to talk for a minute about House Concurrent Resolution, the item of business that is before the United States Senate this morning. This is a House Concurrent Resolution which states in operative part, quote, Congress directs the President to remove United States armed forces from hostilities against the Islamic Republic of Iran. I'm going to urge everyone to vote no on this. It is wrong on so many levels, starting with the fact that a concurrent resolution process, which this attempts to do, has been held unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court. So whatever happens with this, it's going to have no effect. The President isn't going to pay any attention to it. That's one thing. The second thing that's wrong with this is it directs him to remove United States armed forces from hostilities. There are no armed forces at this moment that are engaged in hostilities with Iran. The third thing, and the most important thing, is that voting on this, whether it passes or fails, sends a message to Iran. If this passes, the Iranians are going to simply stand up and walk away from negotiations. They're going to say this thing's over. The Congress has told the President of the United States, leave us alone, we can do whatever we want to do, and they will walk away. If you think that's a good idea, you should vote for this. On the other hand, if you believe that what the President of the United States has done, and that is bring the Iranians to the table to negotiate on items that they have refused to negotiate on for a long time in the past, and has used the armed forces of the United States to bring them to the table, then you should vote no on this. Let diplomacy work. Give the President, give the Department of State, give the current administration the ability to, once again, give Iran the opportunity to do the right thing. Maybe they will. We don't know for sure yet because we have some 50-some days left of the negotiations, but we ought to at least give that an opportunity to work. I urge everyone to vote no on the resolution. Thank you, Mr. President. At the present time, I would notify the President that I have 6 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate stands in recess until 2:15.